Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Jewish Film Festival of Fairfield County. My name is Nancy Schiffman, and I'm the Associate Executive Director of Development and Signature Programs at the Stamford Jewish Community Center. We are so proud to be partnering with USC Shoah Foundation to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day with the screening of their powerful film, Liberation Heroes, The Last Eyewitnesses. I'd like to take this opportunity to especially thank Carol and Peter Lilienthal for their generous sponsorship in memory of family members who perished in the Shoah. Carol and Peter Lilienthal are deeply dedicated to Holocaust education and the vibrancy of the Jewish people. I'd also like to thank all of our festival sponsors and all of our festival committee members for their commitment to bringing award-winning, current and relevant films to our community for the past 19 years. Our mission at the Stamford JCC is to serve, engage, and create community in all environments, adapting as needs arise. COVID has certainly altered the way we convene as a community. Remaining connected to one another is more critical now than ever before. How meaningful is it to be creating community here through film and shared history? Being virtual does have its benefits. Today, our community has expanded across the United States from coast to coast, into Canada, and as far as Germany. We are commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I am sure we have some survivors, as well as many second and third generation survivors, and even some veterans from our armed services with us today. Your presence here is humbling, and we thank you for joining us. It's a privilege to welcome all of you into our Stamford JCC and Jewish Film Festival community. We are proud to be partnering with USC Shoah Foundation, whose mission is to provide testimony-based educational resources on the front lines for educators to inspire empathy and understanding. We'd like to thank and recognize the film's executive producers, Mickey Shapiro and CeCe Chan, who made the film possible, and to acknowledge executive producers Andy Gatow and Stephen Smith. Stephen is the Finchie Verterbi Executive Director of USC Shoah Foundation. We'd also like to thank producers Andy Friendly and June Beeler. On a personal note, I'd like to thank June, with whom this partnership and program would not be possible. We welcome and encourage any questions and comments at any time through the Q&A feature typically found at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer your questions live as time permits. Some questions may be answered in writing directly in the Q&A. And if you have questions that are unanswered, you can absolutely email us after the program. If you haven't yet seen the film, it is available to view until midnight tonight. If you know someone who would enjoy the film, they can still register on our website. With that, I am thrilled to introduce you to our distinguished panel, beginning with our moderator, Professor Jeffrey Chandler. Jeffrey is a distinguished professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers University, a scholar of modern Jewish life who specializes in the study of memory and media in Jewish culture, especially with regard to the Holocaust. He has written books about the Holocaust on American television and about video interviews with Holocaust survivors. He has also served as president of the Association for Jewish Studies and is a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research. Welcome. Joining us on the panel today, we have Vanessa Roth, the director of the documentary. Vanessa is an Oscar, Emmy, DuPont Columbia, and Sundance award-winning nonfiction filmmaker with over 25 years of making documentary features, series, and shorts. She is currently working with Wonder Woman star Gal Gadot on National Geographic-produced short-form documentary series entitled National Geographic Presents Impact with Gal Gadot, and on the upcoming feature documentary Mary J. Blige's My Life for Amazon. Welcome. We have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Michael is the director of the Siggy Zurin Institute and a professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University. Michael was the project director overseeing the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of its research institute. He is also a former executive director of the Shoah Foundation and has won numerous literary and film awards. and is one of the world's leading Holocaust historians. Welcome, Michael. And finally, we welcome Ari Zev. Ari is a past executive director of USC Shoah Foundation, where he served in many leadership roles for over 23 years, including as the head of interviewer training, where he helped oversee the Shoah Foundation's original Holocaust collection. Whew, what a distinguished panel. We are so honored to have you all with us today. Before I turn the floor over to Professor Chandler, while many of you have seen the film, we would like to share the brief trailer.
Unfortunately, the seeds of Hitler's doctrine have been well sown. And it springs up all over the place. Germany has got it. England's got it. France has got it. America's got it.
There's over 800 hate groups in the United States of America. 800 plus hate groups still doing this. I want you to be an upstander, not a bystander. You're the last generation probably going to hear people like me and hear people like the survivors. Time you have children and they hear it, we'll be gone. So you guys got to do the job, your generation. You got to get rid of all this. My generation didn't do it. So get up, be an upstander. That's what I mean. I don't mean you have to fight with somebody, but let them know how you feel.
It's now my pleasure to hand the floor over to Professor Chandler.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Vanessa and Michael and Ari, for joining me in conversation. And welcome to all of you joining us online today on the occasion of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, as we discuss the documentary film Liberation Heroes, The Last Eyewitnesses. This film profiles some of the men and women who were among the first members of the Allied forces to encounter sites where some of the atrocities of the Holocaust were perpetrated in concentration camps and death camps created by the Nazi regime in Germany, in Poland, and other countries. This encounter has proved to be a strategic moment in learning about and remembering the Holocaust, especially here in the United States, to this day. Many Americans first witnessed the visual evidence of the Holocaust when they saw footage, which was filmed in liberated concentration camps by Army Signal Corps cameramen, when it was shown in newsreels and movie theaters in late April and early May of 1945. Some of these images have been screened repeatedly since then, including in the documentary that we are discussing today. With this film, we consider the enduring impact of this moment in the history of the Holocaust. The historian Robert Abzug argues that the liberation of these camps constituted nothing less than a turning point in Western consciousness, and that without the documentation and the reporting of what people witnessed at this moment, we would not know about the Holocaust the way that we do. So let me begin with a question for our filmmaker. Vanessa, how did you become involved with the Shoah Foundation and come to make this film? And why did this subject resonate with you?
Hi. Yeah, so I first actually came in contact with the Shoah Foundation when I was probably in my early 20s, because my mom was one of the first interviewers for the Shoah Foundation when they started collecting the testimonies of survivors and liberators. And she had been an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and I was raised with this idea and just core sense of the importance of testimony and of storytelling and of memory. And so she would come home from doing her interviews with the survivors and tell us their stories. And so then, fast forward, 20 something years later, I was approached by Stephen Smith and June and Andy to get involved in this film that focused on the liberators. And it was also just a very sweet moment, because as I looked through the testimonies, I was able to actually find the interviews that my mom had done with the liberators and the survivors in the collection that Shoah has, which was just really special for me because she's passed away since.
please go ahead.
No, so anyway, so that's sort of the personal side of it. And then on a larger note, just the work that I do, the things that I'm drawn to doing is just finding ways to connect all of us to experiences that sometimes can feel far away and distant from our own personal experience. And this film was one that I felt we had an opportunity to link the past to us today. So that's what drew me to it.
Thank you. I mean, it's fascinating that you have such a long connection to this material. And that actually brings me to my next question for Ari. The documentary includes testimonies from the original collection in the USC Foundation, Shoah Foundation, which Vanessa just mentioned. And can you tell us about the original collection of testimonies and how they were gathered? Ari, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Jeffrey. In 1994, after filming Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg established the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation to record and preserve the testimonies of Holocaust survivors and other witnesses. The initial goals were to give a voice to Holocaust survivors and other witnesses, record each interviewee's life story, and to create and preserve an archive for history and education. And the vision was really that these eyewitnesses would become teachers for future generations. And one of the first things we did was develop relationships in communities around the world so that survivors would be aware of our work and contact us to be interviewed, and people would come forward to apply to be trained as interviewers. We did outreach to community organizations, Holocaust educational organizations, museums, survivor groups. There was a lot of press in the secular press as well as Jewish community newspapers. And there was really a tremendous amount of interest and a lot of word of mouth throughout the world. And we interviewed survivors who were in concentration camps and ghettos, survivors who under false identity, survivors who were children during the war, those in hiding, as well as refugees. And the interviewers, of course, were very integral to all of this. We had a team of over 2,000 interviewers, and they came from a range of ages and backgrounds and professions, but with certain things in common. They came forward in service to this project with personal qualities of commitment, caring, and sensitivity, and with an understanding that the testimony of each Holocaust survivor and witness is very unique. And initially, the archive was comprised mostly of Jewish Holocaust survivors, but we also made an effort early on to reach out to and record other World War II experiences, including rescuers and aid providers, Sinti and Roma survivors, political prisoners, homosexual survivors, Jehovah's Witness survivors, survivors of eugenics policies, as well as war crimes trials participants, and of course, World War II liberators and liberation witnesses. And in the early 90s, our team did targeted outreach to various military organizations and groups to find World War II liberators and liberation witnesses, and we recorded approximately 400 testimonies. The documentary, Liberation Heroes, The Last Eyewitnesses, features a number of excerpts of these testimonies that are among the collection of 400 World War II liberators and liberation witnesses that are part of the USC Shoah Foundation's larger visual history archive. And finally, the liberator perspective is not often explored, and it's such a key point of view for understanding the Holocaust and its ramifications. And it's very meaningful to see the testimonies that were collected back in the 90s, to see them in the documentary and how important and relevant their eyewitness accounts are today.
Thank you, Ari. Michael, I have a question for you about some of these interviews that Ari just mentioned. Some of the liberators who appear in the film say that they didn't share their experiences with anyone for a long time, in some cases for 50 years or more. And can you talk about this phenomenon?
Well, it became very difficult for them to look back. When they came back immediately after the war, they were concentrated on making up for what for them were lost years. Many went on to get their education. Many had wartime nightmares. And the Holocaust was, the encounter with the camps was one of their deepest nightmares. The first breakthrough in hearing from liberators came because of Holocaust denial. Mm. And that is that liberators said, hey, we saw this, we were witnesses. The first, ironically, to go against Holocaust denial was Dwight David Eisenhower, who visited Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945. the very day that Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. And he said, I visited every nick and cranny. I made this visit deliberately because if someday they say it's propaganda, I want to say that I was there. And consequently, until that moment, they really didn't know what was so very important about their encounter and their memory. And that was, if people wanted to say the Holocaust didn't happen, they could say it was there. Let me tell you a personal story which gives you an idea. I was speaking in Ohio, and I get a call one morning at my hotel room from a man by the name of Walter Olston. Now, Walter Olston was the name of the Hall of Fame manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Los Angeles Dodgers, and I thought I was going to meet a great man. So he says, I have something for you. And in walks a physician by the name of Walter Olston, who lives in Dayton, Ohio. And he says, I've been having these photographs for 50 years in my desk, and I've never known what to do with them. And all of a sudden, he brings a whole range of photographs, especially from the hospital that he was working on, trying to heal the survivors that he met. And he didn't know what to do with them. And all of a sudden, he was willing to speak. And we had somebody who could give testimony about the medical condition of these prisoners. And we know that in a place like Bergen-Belsen, 13,000 prisoners died after liberation. We also know that the first food that they ate oftentimes killed them because they weren't capable of processing it. And all of a sudden, somebody came with a unique testimony, unique collection, and understood that his words were valued, and we were prepared to listen. And that became very important for the Liberator. And also they became one of the eyewitnesses who were significant in the encounter between a generation and the Holocaust. And the last point I want to make is they also served as an important bridge between Americans and the Holocaust. We began the Holocaust Museum with the notion of liberation because we wanted to subtly answer what the hell is a museum to a European event doing on the National Mall. And the easiest way to make the transition between the National Mall and the Holocaust was to use the innocent eyes, or the really not so innocent eyes, of the American liberators who had been in battle, who had killed, who had seen buddies die, and who came across this experience and understood they had encountered an evil beyond even their imagination. And they ended up their encounter by asking the question, how could this happen? And then all of a sudden, that was the entree to the museum, which answered the question, how did it happen?
Thank you. Michael, you touched on earlier the fact that a strategic turning point for liberators to speak about what they had seen was Holocaust denial. And that's very resonant with some of the issues that are being confronted currently. We see anti-Semitism, isolationism, xenophobia, other race-based hatred having risen to crisis levels in the past few years. And in the film, you draw a parallel between the past and the present. Can you expand on that?
Well, I'm going to go about it a little bit backwards, Jeffrey, by saying that I have a dream that someday I can be irrelevant. And that is that I study the awesome evil of the Holocaust, and I study genocides in general. And I wish I could consign that to the past. The problem that I have is not that I'm relevant, it's that the world continues to make me relevant. So even as a student of anti-Semitism, we now have to confront anti-Semitism. And as someone who understood the collapse, for example, of the Weimar Republic, with polarization, with the ineffectiveness of democracy, with violence, with the loss of values, and with the loss of the economic crises, all of a sudden there is an interest worldwide in the rise of authoritarianism to replace democracy, and something that I've studied all of a sudden sadly becomes irrelevant. Let me say one sentence about anti-Semitism. There's a total paradox in the American society today. According to Pew's survey, Judaism is the most admired religion in America, meaning in part that it's the least unadmired religion in America, but we can go into that at a different point. The question becomes, why is anti-Semitism on the rise when Judaism itself is admired? The answer to that is threefold. Number one, there is a dramatic increase in hatred and the permissibility of the expression of hatred. Number two, and important, is that we now have the internet as the megaphone and social media as the instrumentality by which the haters feel empowered to express their hatred support in the expression of their hatred. And this is an international phenomenon where even what happens in one country is reflected in another, and what happens in one part of the world is reflected elsewhere in the globe. And that leads to a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism amidst a rise in hatred for people of color, for immigrants, for gays, lesbians, etc., all the way through, and for immigrants in multicultural phenomenon. And this is the world in which we live in. My dream someday is to be able to speak about the past, and everybody's asking me to address the present, which I have to address and I feel empowered to address, but would that what I did was thoroughly and completely irrelevant.
I hear you, and I sympathize with why you feel that way, but I'm glad that you are speaking about things that are relevant. I'd like to turn actually to Vanessa to talk about again a little more about the interviews in the film. The film includes interviews that the Shoah Foundation recorded in the 1990s, which Ari talked about earlier, but also new interviews. And I wonder if you could tell us about the process for making the interviews that you made, and how did you set them apart from the earlier interviews in the construction of your film?
Yeah. So what we wanted to do is, like I was saying before, is tell a story that wasn't just a historical documentation of photos and history telling, but wanted to make sure it felt personal and relatable. And so one of the things we did is we used sort of a camera system that was actually invented by the filmmaker Earl Morris, which he calls it an Interrotron. I don't know the name, but basically what it is, it's a camera that the person that's being interviewed is looking at the interviewer. So I would sit there, but the camera makes it look like the person being interviewed is looking straight into the lens of the camera. So it makes it feel a little bit more personal. And now actually with Zoom, I think we're also used to just looking straight at the at the screen. But what we wanted to do is have a feeling really of the Virgil and Alan and the people that were participating today, to really get the feeling that they're speaking to you as the audience, that they're not speaking off camera to an interviewer, but that they're speaking directly to the audience. So that was one thing we did. And then the other thing that was important to me is this bridging of the generations and in the storytelling, which was why we brought in the cadets to be part of the film. I felt like when we think of people who have been in war and we think of the Holocaust and World War II, it's somebody in their 80s, 90s, in our case, Virgil, who's 103 now, is telling his story. And it becomes, I think, a very easy thing for us to just think of them as this older person that they are today, and not really grasp really internally that they were the age of these cadets. And so we purposely had Alan speaking to cadets because those cadets were the age that he was when the story, when this happened to him in his life. And so by bridging those generations, we wanted to visually show that so that we can understand that. And then also by the end of the film, and really the message of the film, is this idea of the importance of testimony, the importance of telling your story and passing it down to other generations, because of, like in the trailer, he says that really they're the last generation. We are the last generation. These kids are the last generation that will hear the stories directly from the firsthand witnesses, and how important that is. So that was sort of why we did the multi-generations.
Yes, I have to say it was a pleasant surprise to see you visited my campus and filmed some Rutgers students. And I haven't been there in almost a year, so it was actually nice to see the campus, if only on film.
Yeah, and so many of them really didn't know anything about the stories at all, and they really didn't understand or had never really thought about the stories of the liberators. They had maybe they had some education about the Holocaust, but really not from the liberators' perspective. And I think another thing that surprised them, or maybe it surprised them, and then it made sense to them because of their own experiences, is this idea that the Americans knew so little of what they were getting into, and this idea that it wasn't their objective. They didn't go over knowing that they were going to be liberating or assisting anybody in the way that they did. And I think that the cadets, one of the things they were really drawn to, we had this collection of letters that some of the liberators and healthcare workers had kept and passed down through generations. And so the cadets were reading through those and looking at those. And I think they really could empathize with what that must be like to be writing letters home and coming across new things that are things that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, it was a very compelling moment to watch them engage with this material. Thank you so much for that. So I want to turn back to Michael and ask Michael to be relevant again. Can you talk about the section of the film that addresses who knew what and when? And are there lessons for us going forward with regard to being on the alert for the potential of new genocides?
Well, historians make a distinction, as you well know, between knowledge and information. We had a vast amount of information, and for certain people, they internalized that information. It became knowledge for them. And then they acted as if this was a matter of the highest urgency. The task of the American government was essentially to win one war, the World War. The Germans fought, in essence, two wars, the war against the Jews and the World War. And the two of them clashed in a very basic way, because wherever Germany expanded, it got more Jews, and it then felt the need to be rid of those Jews in order to rid them off German territory. We have less of an excuse right now. And the reason we have less of an excuse is our world has instantaneous communication. And we can see the inside of some of the areas in which genocide is taking place. We now know enough also to be able to understand the warning signs of genocide and the different stages of genocide. And consequently, we have all the reason in the world to know in a way that is undeniable. And still we understand that we don't have the political will, with all the difficulties, to respond to the genocides that are taking place. We also sometimes have an interesting clash, even in the United States, we just experienced. Given the nature of the last administration, they were focused on left-wing violence, which meant that the FBI and the intelligence organizations and the like were focused all on left-wing violence, when an entire new form of violence came forth and was brewing, which was the violence that we saw manifested on January 6th. And now you're going to find an interesting thing, which is that we're going to be focused on that violence and not on the other forms of violence that are available. But our excuses now, and I dealt very specifically with the fact that the best piece of information we had on the murder of the Jews was a telegram that arrived in the United States on August 29th, 1942. It spoke of the planned murder for the fall of 4.5 million Jews and the use of Zyklon B. That came 8 months after a meeting on January 20th, 1942, and I say it because it was only the 11 days ago was the anniversary, anniversary of that, in which under discussion was 11 million Jews targeted to be murdered. The final solution was also operative for already 6 months, and it wasn't a planned operation, it was an actually implemented operation, and we seemingly knew nothing about it. And when Rabbi Wise went to the State Department to say, what do you know about it? They said to him, we don't, give us some months to verify it. And they indeed came back to him in November 1942 and said, we can confirm your darkest fears. It's at that moment that they then did something that is unimaginable today, which is when he went public with the information, the State Department announced that we can neither confirm nor deny his reports. They had just confirmed his reports, but they didn't want anything to interfere, any other concerns to interfere with the war effort. So they kept themselves at distance from the genocide. And the most interesting thing that came out with Vanessa's interviews and everything else is none of the soldiers knew that there were concentration camps that they were going to liberate. This was an accidental encounter en route to capturing Berlin. And what hit them all was the fact that they weren't prepared for this. They didn't know how to behave. They didn't know that such a thing could occur. And that led to the shock. And these were not innocent men. These were men who had been battle hard. They had been through the Battle of the Bulge. Many of them had been through D-Day. So they'd seen an awful lot of violence. And then they entered the camps, a world dramatically different. So it was an accidental encounter for which they were unprepared. We could have known, we should have done something, but we never wanted to piece together all the levels of information.
Thank you, Michael. As Michael mentions, there's this challenge between having the information and acting on it, and this applies to other genocides as well. And this is something that the Shoah Foundation has turned its attention to more recently. Ari, can you explain how the Shoah Foundation has expanded the Visual History Archive to include interviews with people talking about other genocides and other atrocities?
Sure. So early on, we had always hoped to collect testimonies of other genocides and other experiences for education and the future. The addition of the first 64 Rwandan testimonies in 2013 marked the initial expansion of the archive beyond the Holocaust. Each new collection adds context for the others. They provide multiple pathways to learn from the eyewitnesses of history across time, locations, cultures, and socio-political circumstances. So while the archive was initially a repository of Holocaust testimony, it has expanded significantly to include survivor and witness testimony from other genocidal events, including collecting and recording new testimonies from the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Nanjing massacre in China, the Cambodian genocide, the Guatemalan genocide, and the ongoing conflicts in the Central African Republic and South Sudan, as well as anti-Rohingya mass violence. And the archive now also includes testimonies about contemporary acts of violence against Jews. The organization also preserves testimonies from other existing archives. For example, testimonies of survivors of the Armenian genocide. For this collection, the USC Shoah Foundation partnered with the Armenian Film Foundation and the late Dr. J. Michael Hagopian, a wonderful man who I remember well, who filmed all the interviews. And these testimonies were integrated into the Visual History Archive in April 2015, which actually coincided with the 100-year anniversary of the Armenian genocide.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the testimonies in the Visual History Archive are being made available to educators in new ways?
So the USC Shoah Foundation offers various educational products for students and teachers, including Eyewitness. So Eyewitness, the organization's signature free educational website, is geared towards middle and high schools. And Eyewitness provides access to thousands of testimonies and over 100 testimony-based activities for teachers that boost subject matter knowledge, cultivate empathy and an understanding of diverse races and cultures, improve critical thinking skills, develop digital literacy skills, and also include activities that explore topics like resilience, mindfulness, empathy, courage, and gratitude. And also, Eyewitness has been a powerful and vital tool for educators during the pandemic, during the shift to greater online and at-home learning. Another resource is the Echoes and Reflection program, which is in partnership with the ADL and Yad Vashem. Echoes and Reflections is dedicated to reshaping the way that teachers and students understand and navigate the world through events of the Holocaust. The program has empowered more than 85,000 teachers and reached an estimated 8 million students across the United States. And in addition to tools for teachers and students, USC Shoah Foundation is also working with scholars and fellows to support research and unlock the many powerful lessons in the archive through the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And the archive now is also available in its entirety at over 165 access sites in 32 countries, which include universities such as Columbia, NYU, and Cornell, just to name a few. And then there is also the Stronger Than Hate initiative, which addresses current levels of hatred of all kinds and uses all of the resources across many campuses and programs. And finally, the USC Shoah Foundation has also developed some cutting-edge technologies to make testimonies more interactive and bring them to larger audiences. So there is really so much, and I encourage everyone to go to the USC Shoah Foundation's website to learn more.
Thank you so much, Ari. And I see that in the chat, some of the links have been posted to learn about some of the things that Ari just mentioned. My last question is for Vanessa, and I want to ask you to offer us some final thoughts about the impact that making this film had on you, and especially working both with some of the Visual History Archive testimonies and with the folks that you got to interview yourself.
Yeah, I just, again, watching the trailer again and hearing everybody speak, just in the trailer, just what just keeps resonating, this 800 hate groups. 800 hate groups is, it's just, I mean, it leaves me speechless and thinking of, and when Alan, again, in the trailer too, talks about being the last generation to hear first eyewitnesses accounts. And I think just what's impacted me as I'm a mom of 3 kids, and thinking just really personally about how do we tell our stories. And, you know, it's important that we have these archives. It's important that we have these films, but I think on a personal level for all of us as children, parents, grandparents, grandchildren, that we really all make an effort to ask questions of the older generations and the younger generations to bridge that gap. I think one of the stunning things to me was this idea that because of the trauma and the pain, so many people didn't speak about their experiences and they moved on in their lives, and maybe didn't think it was important, maybe didn't think people wouldn't, maybe thought people wouldn't understand, or maybe they thought it would be too shocking to hear. But what I heard from Alan, and I've heard from so many others, and is just true with trauma, right, is once you speak your story and you tell your truth, there's a flood that comes out. Some of that can be hard to deal with, but it also can be very freeing as well, and for both the teller and the listener. And so I think to me that's the biggest the biggest impact it's had really on me personally is the impact and importance of storytelling and passing down memory and passing down the stories of your life in order for the next generation to hold that in some way.
Thank you so much.
Jeffrey, can I add one thing? Which will link what Ari said with and what Vanessa said with Delight. We're in an incredible moment. We are at the moment of transition between living memory and historical memory. And that's what it means to be the last generation to encounter the living witnesses. What the Shoah Archives is trying to do is to give the resources for future generations, something that no previous generation had, which is a comparable access to living memory that the generation that lived in the presence of these survivors had. Let me give you one example. We only have 36 recorded eyewitness testimonies to what it was like to be a slave. When I left the foundation in 2000, we had 52,000 video testimonies of what it was like to be in the Holocaust. Imagine in historical memory. Imagine if we had access, if you're a believing Christian, if you had access to people who lived in the time of Jesus, who heard him preach, who experienced what it was like to be in that presence. We only have the recordings, the writings, 60, 70, 80 years later, which form the Gospels. Imagine if we had people who actually experienced the Exodus and went through it, and you had access to living memory for centuries and generations. That's what they've been trying to do. That's what we've been trying to do. And this is an incredible achievement whose implications we will not understand for a generation or two.
Thank you. I agree that our work as people, whether it's filmmakers or scholars or teachers working with this material, researchers of all kinds, we are just beginning to address the next steps of how we work with and deal with and pass on this abundance of material that has been recorded from Holocaust survivors and eyewitnesses. And Vanessa's film is one very important example of this process. So I want to thank the panelists all, and I now believe it is time for us to address any questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn the proceedings back to Nancy.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I have to say that most of the comments in the Q&A and in the chat, folks are really resonating with the film, its story, the personal connection that they've had, their parents or grandparents. And so it has really created a lovely conversation, even behind the scenes. And so many of folks' questions were answered by the things that you shared. So we truly appreciate that. Someone did ask a question about, and how would you address this, about what's happening in England, where much of Holocaust education information is being removed from the textbooks and the books due to feelings that it would insult or there's objection from the Muslim community. I don't know if anyone can speak to that.
That's an urban legend. Meaning that England is now in the process of considering building right next to Parliament a memorial and education center. They've been taking testimony for that. This was a project initiated by David Cameron when he visited Berlin and saw the impact of the Eisenman Memorial in Berlin and the educational center underground. So they are giving it enormous prominence. England also has now taken very significant steps in the Labour Party in the aftermath of Jeremy Corbyn to dismiss, to get rid of anti-Semitism from within the Labour Party. The Muslim mayor of London has taken tremendous steps on this account. And the other thing is that they are in the process of renovating and rebuilding the Holocaust Museum that is the part of the Imperial War Museum. So England had significant anti-Semitism in its Labour leadership up until the last election, when Jeremy Corbyn was defeated, and you had a very unique thing. The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom spoke out, and the next day, the Archbishop of Canterbury reinforced his views and said, we cannot tolerate and accept anti-Semitism. And this was an unprecedented 1-2 step from leadership to deeply morally condemn anti-Semitism at the highest moral levels of that society. That's a little bit of good news on the anti-Semitism front. Leadership has to confront it morally, ethically, and publicly, political leadership and the moral leaders of the nation.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing that. I asked the panel, since most of the questions that the audience have already been answered, as I had said, are there any further thoughts or comments that any one of you have?
One of the people asked a very interesting question. How can we compare the events of January 6th to the Holocaust? The answer is we have to understand that comparison is not equation. Nothing is quite equivalent to the Holocaust, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have something to say. It clearly is not a mass murder. It clearly is not a genocide, but it clearly has problems associated with the nature of the polarization of society. And whenever you compare, as I do with my students, as Jeffrey does with his students, you always ask them to compare and to contrast. If the Holocaust is an incomparable event because nothing is quite its equivalent, if it's an incomparable event, it has nothing to say to our age and our time. If every comparison compares and contrasts, and we understand the distinctions and the differences as well as what it shares to common, then it can speak to our generation and warn us of the dangers of polarization and of our politics becoming a politics of violence.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Does anyone else have any other closing thoughts or comments? Well, on behalf of the Stamford JCC and the Jewish Film Festival of Fairfield County, we are deeply grateful to our partner, USC Shoah Foundation, and our incredible panelists, and to all of you for joining us here today to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We hope you'll join us for the Shoah Foundation programs, this upcoming live stream launch on February 4th of the Alan Moskin Dimensions Testimony exhibit in the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Alan Moskin is one of the liberators featured in Liberation Heroes, and the exhibit enlists the new technology that was featured in 60 Minutes. To get more information about the online event, you can go to the US Shoah Foundation's website. We hope that you join us for other Stamford JCC and festival events. And once again, we are just delighted to have all of you, you wonderful panelists. It's been a pleasure hearing what you have to share. We thank you so much. And we thank all of you for joining us. We hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and we're wishing you tremendous health. Thank you all.